Claire hadn't intended to adopt a dog that day. She'd only stopped by the shelter to drop off a box of old towels. But something pulled her inside. Maybe it was the rain tapping against the windows, or maybe it was something unexplainable. Tugged deep in her chest, that the shelter smelled of wet fur and antiseptic. Barking echoed down the narrow hallway, each cage holding a different kind of heartbreak. Some dogs barked frantically, others whimpered. Claire moved slowly, glancing at the names on the cages: Max, Daisy, Bruno. All were desperate for attention. Then, she saw him dot in the far corner of the last row. A large German shepherd lay silently, his head resting between his paws. He didn't bark or even lift his eyes. His fur was matted, his ribs faintly visible beneath his coat, and a dirty bandage wrapped tightly around one of his hind legs. "Who's this one?" Claire asked the shelter worker, a tired woman with a ponytail and a coffee stain on her scrubs. The woman glanced down the hall, then sighed. "That's just the shepherd. No name. He's been here a while. Hurt his leg somewhere, don't know how. We patched him up as best we could." Claire took a step closer to the cage. The dog's ears twitched, but he didn't move. Why? Doesn't he have a name? No owner ever came forward. No chip either. He doesn't trust anyone, doesn't bark, doesn't bite, just lies there. We've tried everything. The woman leaned closer and lowered her voice. He's on the list for next week. Claire didn't ask what the list meant. She knew. Her heart clenched. How much is the adoption fee? The woman looked at her like she was asking to buy a bag of flour. For him? $5. Honestly, we'd just be glad someone gave him a chance. Claire hesitated only for a second. She reached into her wallet, pulled out a wrinkled $5 bill, and handed it over. The shelter worker raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" Claire nodded. "Yeah, I'm sure." 20 minutes later, after some hurried paperwork and a brief, awkward attempt to slip a leash around the dog's neck, Claire walked out into the rain with the German shepherd limping beside her. He didn't pull or resist. He simply followed. His eyes dull, as if expecting nothing from the world. She named him Shadow on the drive home. The ride was quiet. No barking, no excitement. Just silence. Claire kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror. He didn't make eye contact. He didn't react to her voice. He just stared out the window, as if lost in another lifetime. Her apartment wasn't fancy, but it was warm and safe. She spread out a blanket in the corner, poured a bowl of water, and opened a can of wet food. Shadow didn't move. Hours passed. The food sat untouched. The water remained still. That first night, Claire slept on the couch just a few feet from where he lay. She didn't try to touch him. She didn't try to coax him. She just stayed close, hoping he could feel she meant no harm. As she drifted off, she whispered, "You're safe now, Shadow. Whatever happened before, it's over." He didn't respond. But in the quiet of the room, she thought she saw his tail twitch just once. It wasn't much, but it was enough. What Claire didn't know then was that Shadow wasn't just any abandoned dog. He had lived a life full of duty, fear, and loyalty. He had seen things no animal should see. And now, even though he was broken and discarded, something inside him recognized something in her, a gentle determination, a kind of sadness she carried, but never spoke of. He didn't trust easily. But for reasons unknown, he hadn't growled. He hadn't flinched. He had followed her home. And that small, silent choice would be the beginning of something extraordinary. The first few days with Shadow were harder than Claire expected. He didn't eat. He didn't bark. He barely moved. He paced the living room in slow, dragging circles, or lay by the window, staring at nothing. Sometimes he'd flinch at the sound of footsteps in the hallway or the buzz of Claire's phone. She kept the TV low, avoided sudden movements, and tried to speak gently whenever she passed by him. "Good morning, Shadow," she'd say softly as she poured her coffee, trying to make the unfamiliar feel routine. But Shadow didn't react. He didn't look at her, didn't wag his tail, didn't even sniff the air when she brought him treats. His food bowl stayed full for 2 days. She called the vet in a panic, but they told her not to worry. He was likely experiencing severe emotional trauma. "Just give him time," the vet said. "He's been through something." Claire didn't know what that something was, but she could feel the weight of it in the room. Shadow's presence was heavy, not dangerous. Just ... haunted. She didn't give up. Every night, she laid a pillow beside his blanket and read aloud from whatever book she was working through. Her voice would quiver sometimes, especially when she felt silly reading to a dog who didn't even acknowledge her, but she kept going. She talked to him about her day, about her job at the bakery, about how she hated Mondays and loved thunderstorms. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something shifted. On the 5th day, he sniffed the corner of a biscuit she had left near his paw. The next morning, she found the biscuit gone. A few hours later, the water bowl had a ripple in it. Progress. Then came the tail wag. It was so subtle, she almost missed it. Claire had just come home from work, keys jingling in the lock, when Shadow's tail moved just once. A small flick, but it was real. It was the first sign that somewhere inside, he was beginning to recognize her as something other than a stranger. When she knelt nearby and whispered, "Hi, buddy," he didn't move away. Claire took baby steps. She never forced affection. But every time Shadow let her get a little closer, she celebrated like they'd won a marathon. She documented it all in a journal. Day 7. Ate half his food. Day 9. Followed me to the kitchen. Day 12. Let me brush his fur for 2 full minutes. Still, the nights were hardest. Sometimes Shadow would jolt awake from deep sleep, growling low, his body shaking. His eyes darted around the room like he wasn't sure where he was. Claire stayed, still letting him calm on his own. She didn't reach for him or say his name. She just stayed close, a quiet presence in the dark. One evening, as she sat on the floor reading a chapter of her book, Shadow limped over and sat beside her. Not close enough to touch, but closer than ever before. Claire stopped reading mid-sentence, holding her breath. He lay down with a soft sigh and rested his head on his paws. For the first time, Claire saw something different in his eyes. Not fear, not confusion, but something gentler. Like recognition. That night, she didn't sleep on the couch. She curled up on the floor next to him, blanket pulled tight, his breath steady beside her. The next morning, she woke up to find Shadow sitting at the edge of the blanket, watching her. His ears were perked, and when she whispered, "Good boy," he blinked and looked away, but didn't leave. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't instant healing, but it was something. And Claire knew, without a doubt, that the dog everyone said was broken was still in there somewhere. Shadow just needed someone to wait patiently, to see past the silence, and to believe he was worth saving. She was willing to do that. No matter how long it took. Weeks passed, and Shadow slowly became more comfortable in his new home. He still had his moments. Certain sounds would send him retreating to his corner, and he sometimes stared at the front door for hours, as if waiting for someone who'd never return. But the change in him was undeniable. Claire noticed he had an unusual reaction to specific phrases. When she said, "Stay," he would immediately sit with stiff posture, eyes alert. When she casually said, "Search," while looking for her keys, he'd lift his head, scanning the room. One day, while jokingly pointing at a box and saying, "Clear," Shadow approached it and circled around, sniffing the corners like he was looking for something dangerous. That's when Claire began to wonder, One Saturday, she took him for a checkup at a new veterinary clinic that offered behavioral consultations. The young vet, Dr. Ramirez, was impressed by Shadow's demeanor. He's obedient, precise. Has he had any special training? Claire shook her head. Not from me. He's just different. Dr. Ramirez tilted his head, then pulled out a microchip scanner. Let's check something. The scanner beeped. Claire leaned forward. Wait, he has a chip? Yes, but the info is odd. It's registered to a government K-9 unit in Texas. Military. Claire's mouth fell open. Military? Are you serious? The vet nodded. Looks like his name was Thor. Assigned to the 14th Military Police Detachment, Fort Bliss. He went missing in action 3 years ago. Declared dead after a convoy explosion in Kandahar. Claire couldn't speak. All this time, she thought she had rescued a broken shelter dog. But Shadow Thor wasn't just any stray. He was a soldier. A war hero. And someone had given up on him. The room felt still, too quiet. Claire's heart pounded in her chest. Is there someone I should call? Dr. Ramirez hesitated. There's a protocol. But first, let me contact the unit listed. They may want to know he's alive. Claire went home with Shadow, her mind racing. The pieces started to fall into place, the way he scanned alleys during walks, how he froze when helicopters flew overhead, his reaction to sharp commands. He hadn't forgotten his training. He hadn't forgotten anything. That night, she sat across from him on the living room floor. Thor, she whispered. His ears twitched. She repeated it, firmer this time. Thor. He looked at her, his gaze steady and unblinking. Claire's throat tightened. You're not just Shadow, are you? You've seen things, done things. And they left you out there. Shadow Thor slowly walked toward her and rested his head on her knee. She broke down in tears. In the days that followed, Dr. Ramirez got a call from someone who confirmed the details. Thor had served in a bomb detection unit, saving countless lives. After the explosion that killed his handler, he went missing. They'd assumed the worst. But somehow, miraculously, he'd survived only to be forgotten. Claire didn't want to give him up, but she knew she'd have to follow protocol. Yet when the military official finally called her, they surprised her. Thor's officially retired. You've been taking care of him longer than we ever did. He's yours now if you want him. Claire hung up the phone, breathless. She looked over at the shepherd, curled up in his favorite corner, his fur soft, his eyes peaceful for once. I want him, she whispered. I want him more than anything. From that moment on, she no longer saw him as a broken dog. She saw him for who he was, a survivor, a soldier, a guardian. And now, he had finally found home. Learning Shadow's true identity changed everything. Claire no longer treated him like a rescue project. She saw him for what he was, a decorated war dog with battle scars no one could see. She dove into research, reading articles about military K-9 units, studying training manuals, and watching handler videos online. She wanted to understand the life he had lived, the commands he knew, the structure he'd once thrived under. So one morning, she stood in the living room and spoke firmly. Sit. Shadow sat immediately, spine straight, ears perked. His eyes were alert, no longer clouded by confusion. Claire blinked, stunned. Down. He obeyed again, swiftly lowering himself to the ground. She stepped forward and whispered, Good boy. Thor. His tail wagged once. That was the first time she called him by his old name and saw a flicker of recognition and pride in his eyes. It was like he remembered who he used to be. And now he knew she saw him that way too. From then on, they began each morning with structured routines. A leash-free walk around the block where he stayed close without being asked. Commands in Short, confident tones. Stay. Heal. Search brought out the soldier still buried inside him. With each passing day, his posture straightened, his eyes sharpened, and the hesitation in his steps disappeared. Neighbors who once avoided him now smiled and waved as he walked proudly beside Claire. Children peeked from porches and pointed. "Look at that dog, Mommy. He's like a police dog." One elderly veteran, walking slowly with a cane, stopped on the sidewalk one morning as Shadow passed by. The man stared hard at him, then whispered, "That's no regular dog." Claire smiled. "You're right. He's not." At home, Shadow became her silent guardian. He positioned himself near the front door during the night, occasionally doing a perimeter check of the apartment. Claire didn't train him to do this. He simply acted on instinct. More than once, she caught herself smiling at his habits. He was no longer the broken, quiet dog curled in a corner. He was vigilant, aware, and fiercely protective. What surprised her most, however, was how gentle he could be. When Claire had a panic attack one night, a wave of anxiety crashing over her after a stressful phone call, she curled up on the floor, heart racing. Shadow approached slowly, pressed his body against her side, and laid his head across her lap. He didn't move, didn't bark. He just stayed with her until her breathing slowed. She cried into his fur. He didn't move an inch. After that, she realized their bond wasn't just built on training or routine. It was deeper emotional. He had learned her rhythms just as she was learning his. He knew when she was overwhelmed, just as she could sense when something outside triggered his unease. They were healing dash together, to celebrate his progress. Claire took him on a weekend trip to a quiet lake outside town. It was their first time away from home, and she worried how he'd react to the unfamiliar environment. But the moment Shadow saw the open space, the shimmering water, and the empty trail winding around the woods, his demeanor changed completely. He ran, not from fear but for joy. His legs, once wounded and weak, powered across the grass. His tongue lolled, ears back, and for the first time, Claire heard something she hadn't since she adopted him. Barking. Playful. Loud. Free. She laughed, tears streaming down her face as she watched him splash into the water and spin in circles. This wasn't the dog from the shelter. This was Thor. Shadow. Whoever he had been, he was whole again. And as the sun set behind the trees, Claire sat beside him, damp and muddy, and whispered, "You came back to life." Shadow nuzzled into her side. He had. It started like any other evening. Claire had made dinner, fed Shadow, and curled up on the couch with a book, while Shadow rested near the door, his usual position during the nights. The room was quiet, except for the soft hum of the heater and the occasional rustling of Shadow's ears, twitching in sleep. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, a reminder of the storm that was rolling in. Claire stood to wash her plate, but halfway to the sink, her vision blurred. Her head swam. She grabbed the counter for support. Her breath caught in her throat, and suddenly she was gasping for air. Her new medication, the one she'd only just started 2 days ago. Something was wrong. Her throat was swelling. Her fingers went numb. The kitchen light spun like a carousel, and then her legs gave out. She collapsed to the floor, clutching at her chest. Shadow sprang up instantly. At first, he barked, a deep, urgent sound that echoed through the apartment. When Claire didn't respond, he ran to her side, circling frantically, sniffing her face, pawing at her arm. She barely managed to move her lips. Help. She couldn't reach her phone. In a flash, Shadow bolted to the front door. He scratched, whined, and hurled his full weight against it. Again and again. When the latch didn't give, he howled a piercing, sharp cry that filled the hallway. Down the corridor, Claire's neighbor, Mrs. Langley, was startled by the sound. She hesitated, then stepped into the hall. The howling grew louder, desperate. Mrs. Langley approached Claire's door and knocked. "Claire? Everything okay?" No answer, only the relentless bark. Then she heard the faintest thud from inside. That was enough. She called 911 and summoned the building superintendent to open the door. Shadow didn't retreat when they came in. Instead, he darted to Claire's side, barking sharply. Refusing to let them waste a second, paramedics arrived minutes later. They found Claire pale, barely breathing. One look, and they knew anaphylactic shock. If they'd arrived 5 minutes later, it might have been too late. As she was wheeled out on the stretcher, Shadow tried to follow, whining low in his throat. One of the EMTs knelt beside him and gave a small salute. "Good boy, you saved her." At the hospital, Claire woke up hours later, weak but stable. She turned her head slowly, searching the room with bleary eyes. "Shadow?" she croaked. The nurse smiled and nodded. "He's waiting in the lobby. Won't budge from the door." Claire closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. She had saved him for $5, and he had just saved her life when she was well enough to leave. The staff made an exception and allowed Shadow to visit her hospital room before discharge. The moment he saw her, his entire body relaxed. He padded across the floor, rested his chin on the edge of her bed, and sighed deeply. Claire reached out and stroked his fur. "You knew," she whispered. "You knew I needed you." His eyes never left hers. Back home, she framed the discharge report beside the $5 adoption receipt. To anyone else, it might have looked like a silly keepsake. But to Claire, it was a reminder that love, true, selfless love, could be found in the most unexpected places. Everyone thought she had rescued a broken dog. But no, it was clear. Shadow had always been whole. He had simply been waiting for the right person to need him again. And on that cold, terrifying night, he had shown the world exactly what a $5 dog was worth. Everything. By the time Claire returned home from the hospital, word had already spread. The EMT who treated her had shared the story with a local journalist, a trusted friend who wrote a small feature for the town paper. The headline read, $5 Dog Saves Owner's Life in Heroic Midnight Rescue. Claire thought it would stop there, a touching article buried on page 4. But within days, the story exploded online. Pet rescue forums shared it, then national news picked it up. Suddenly, Claire's quiet life with Shadow was flooded with attention. Journalists knocked on her door. Local news stations requested interviews. They wanted photos of Shadow. They asked Claire how she found him, how she knew he was special. She tried to remain humble, often replying, "I didn't rescue him. I just gave him a chance." The article had also reached military circles. One afternoon, Claire received a call from a man who introduced himself as Sergeant Paul Jensen Thor's original handler's commanding officer. "I was there when the convoy went down," he said softly. "We thought he was gone. We looked. For days, losing him broke the whole team." Claire listened, heart pounding. "We never stopped hoping. But when the official report listed him Mia, eventually, we had to let go." His voice cracked. "And now, here he is alive." Sergeant Jensen emailed her pictures of Thor in uniform, sitting proudly next to his handler, Sergeant Reyes. In one photo, Thor wore a camouflage vest with a patch that read, "Protect, Serve, Sacrifice." In another, he stood beside rows of soldiers, his chest puffed, tail up, eyes full of pride. Claire printed them all and placed them in a scrapbook titled, "The Life Before." A week later, she received an official invitation from Fort Bliss, a veterans ceremony honoring retired and fallen service animals. They wanted to recognize Thor aka Shadow with a Medal of Service and Retirement honors. Claire was stunned. She looked at Shadow, now napping beside the couch with his paw twitching in sleep. He had no idea he was about to step back into a world that had long mourned him out at the ceremony. Claire dressed in a navy blue dress. Shadow wore a sleek new harness with his name stitched in gold. As they entered the hall, silence fell. Rows of soldiers young and old stood as the retired K-9 walked past them. Some saluted, others wiped their eyes. When Sergeant Jensen took the stage and told the story of Thor's loyalty during deployment and his survival against the odds, entire room gave a standing ovation. Then came the moment Claire would never forget. Young soldier stepped forward, carrying a small box. Inside was a military K-9 service medal, engraved with Thor's name and dates of active duty. As the medal was placed around Shadow's neck, the crowd erupted into applause. Claire knelt beside him, arms wrapped around his broad chest. Shadow didn't bark or flinch. He simply stood tall, head raised, tail swaying gently. He was no longer a forgotten stray. He was honored. He was home. After the ceremony, veterans approached to thank Claire for giving Thor a second chance. One older man knelt and hugged Shadow tightly. "I served with dogs like him in Nam," he said. "They never get the thanks they deserve." Claire smiled through her tears. "He deserves everything." That night, back at home, Claire placed the medal in a shadow box above the fireplace, right beside the adoption receipt. 2 frames, one for the past and one for the present. Shadow lay curled by the fire, warm and content. For the first time, Claire realized his journey wasn't just about rescue. It was about redemption. And in giving him a new life, she had found her own purpose too. In the months after the ceremony, Claire felt something shift inside her. Shadow had brought her so far from isolation and fear to community and purpose. She couldn't keep their story to herself any longer. There were other Shadows out there, other dogs who had served and been forgotten, others who needed one more chance. And there were people like her who were quietly hurting and didn't even know what they needed until something or rare. Someone saved them. So Claire got to work. She started a blog called Second Watch, chronicling Shadow's journey and sharing what she had learned about retired military dogs. The response was overwhelming. Comments poured in from across the country, veterans who missed their K-9 partners, families looking to adopt service dogs, and others who just found hope in her story. With encouragement from readers and help from the Fort Bliss Veterans Group, Claire filed for nonprofit status. Her goal: to rescue, rehabilitate, and rehome retired service dogs while providing education and support for both the animals and their new families. She named it Shadow's Light. Shadow, of course, became the foundation's heart and soul. Claire began visiting veteran support centers, PTSD clinics, and shelters. Shadow walked quietly beside her, calm and composed, offering comfort simply by existing. During one visit to a VA hospital, a young man named Ethan, who hadn't spoken in weeks, locked eyes with Shadow and suddenly reached out. "Thor?" he whispered, confused. Claire shook her head gently. "No, this is Shadow, but he's been through a lot, just like you." Ethan smiled faintly and nodded. For the first time in months, he said, "He knows." That moment confirmed everything. Claire believed. Shadow wasn't just a hero. He was a healer. Everywhere they went, Shadow had an uncanny way of sensing who needed him most. He'd rest his head on the lap of a grieving mother. He'd sit beside a restless child and not move until the child calmed. Once, during a group therapy session for combat veterans, Shadow walked straight to a man standing in the corner, stiff and silent. The man fell to his knees and wept into Shadow's fur. Claire stood back, hands clasped, watching quietly. No longer tried to explain it. It was just who he was. The foundation grew. Donations rolled in. Volunteers signed up, and dogs began to arrive, some limping, some blind, some terrified of loud noises. But under Shadow's quiet watch, something beautiful happened. They changed. Just like he had, Claire trained each dog using the same patience and compassion she'd used with Shadow. And when they were ready, she found them homes, often with veterans who needed a companion that truly understood pain, fear, and loyalty. Shadow's light became more than a rescue. It became a movement. One morning, while reviewing emails at the kitchen table, Claire looked down and noticed Shadow lying on his bed with 3 foster puppies snuggled against him. He opened one eye, gave her a sleepy glance, and let out a sigh. Claire laughed. "You're such a softie." He wagged his tail once, proudly. He was older now. His once sharp features had softened with age, and silver streaked his muzzle. But he was still strong, still devoted, still Shadow. And Claire? She had become someone new too, stronger, more open, more whole. She no longer felt like the broken woman who walked into the shelter that rainy day. She was now a leader, a speaker, and a voice for the voiceless, all because of a dog no one had wanted. One she'd found for just $5. Together, they had saved lives, but neither of them knew that the most powerful chapter was still to come. Years passed, and Shadow grew slower. His joints ached in the mornings, and his naps grew longer. But he remained Claire's constant shadow, following her from room to room, resting near the fireplace during meetings, and quietly comforting every veteran and child who came through the doors of Shadow's light. Claire cherished every moment. She saw the signs he was getting older, but she wasn't ready to say goodbye. Shadow had given her everything. She didn't know how to live without him. One snowy morning, she found him on the porch, staring out across the white-dusted fields. His breath came slow. His eyes, though tired, still held that same calm, steady fire. Claire knelt beside him and stroked his fur. "You okay, boy?" He turned his head and licked her hand, gently. That night, he didn't eat his dinner. He curled up beside her bed instead of on it, as if already trying to make space for her heart to begin healing. Claire sat beside him on the floor all night, her hand resting on his side. When the sun rose, Shadow gave her one last look, full of peace, full of love, and quietly let go. Claire didn't cry right away. She simply lay beside him, whispering, "Thank you," over and over again. The next week, people from across the country came to honor him. Soldiers, veterans, children he'd comforted, adopters from Shadow's light, they all showed up. The local park held a memorial service, unveiling a bronze statue of Shadow in his working harness. Eyes forward, tail mid-wag. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Shadow, Guardian, Healer, Hero, from $5 to forever. You didn't just save a life, you changed hundreds." Claire stood in front of the statue with a folded flag in her hands and Shadow's medal around her neck. The same EMT who first found them came forward and hugged her, whispering, "I still tell people about that night." Claire smiled. "Me, too." In the months that followed, Claire felt Shadow's absence like a missing heartbeat. But one day, while visiting a local shelter for a scheduled intake, she saw a familiar pair of eyes peeking out from behind the kennel bars, golden, cautious but hopeful. A pup, barely a year old, who'd been left behind after his owner was deployed. He didn't bark. He didn't flinch. He just stared at her as if waiting. Claire knelt. "Hey, little one." He wagged his tail gently. She read the tag, unnamed, male, intake number 4732. Without hesitation, Claire smiled through tears and said, "Welcome to Shadow's light." She named him Echo, a tribute to the dog who had started it all. Echo never replaced Shadow, No dog ever could. But he carried a piece of Shadow's spirit, and Claire saw that gift in every nuzzle, every mission. Every life touched Dot. She kept the photo album on the coffee table, the life before. Next to it sat a second book, the lives after. Claire's home remained full of dogs, hope, and second chances. She often told visitors the same story, how she found an injured German shepherd for $5, never knowing he would become her rescuer, her partner, and the reason she'd find her life's calling. Shadow had given her more than loyalty. He had given her purpose, and even in his absence, he kept giving. Every time a soldier embraced a dog, every time a lonely child found a friend, every time someone broken walked away whole again, Shadow lived on. Dot in fur, Dot in spirit, Dot in every life that followed.